Chapter Y. Language Introduction. The liberal arts of grammar, rhetoric, and logic are all concerned with language. Each of these disciplines establishes its own rules for the use of language, each by reference to a SPE-style standard of excellence or correctness which measures language as an instrument of thought or communication. Together these three arts regulate discourse as a whole. Their relation to one another represents the relation of the various aspects of discourse, the emotional, the social, and the intellectual. The tradition of the great books is the tradition of the liberal arts. Their greatness consists not only in the magnitude of the ideas or problems with which they deal, but also in their formal excellence as products of liberal art. Some of the great books are expositions of logic or rhetoric, none is a treatise on grammar, but they all plainly exemplify, even where they do not expound, the special refinements of the arts of language, and many of them, especially the works of science, philosophy, and theology, and even some of the poetical works, deal explicitly with the difficulties of discourse, and the devices that have been used to overcome them. Language is their instrument, and they are consciously critical in its use. One of the great books, Augustine's Treatise on Christian Doctrine, is directly and explicitly concerned with grammar in the broad sense of the art of reading. Addressed to earnest students of the word, it attempts to lay down rules for interpretation, and in so doing it, is compared by Augustine to one who teaches reading, that is, shows others how to read for themselves. It is not reading in general, however, but the reading of one book, the Bible, with which Augustine is concerned. We shall return later to this special problem of interpreting the Word of God, or language which is thought to be inspired. In our day, there is a lively interest in the problems of language. This is partly because of the development of historical and comparative studies of the various human languages, and the scientific formulation of what is common to all languages in origin, structure, and change. But it also results in part from the claims of a discipline popularly called semantics to have discovered the properties of language as a medium of expression, and especially to have discovered its limitations. The claims of semantics often go so far as to find in the misuse of language the origin of many human ills. The novelty of semantics is supposed to lie both in the diagnosis and in the remedies proposed. Of these two sources of current interest in language, the second calls attention to the vitality of the liberal arts, of which semantics is a contemporary formulation. It might almost be said that there is nothing new about semantics except the name. Hobbes, Bacon, and Locke, for example, deal explicitly with the abuses of language and the treachery of words. Each makes recommendations for the correction of these faults. Plato and Aristotle, Augustine and Aquinas, Berkeley and Hume, are similarly concerned with ambiguity in speech, with the multiple senses in which discourse of every sort can be interpreted, and with the methods by which men can approximate precision in the use of language. The other interest in language is also represented in the great books. Though the science of linguistics and the history of languages are researches of recent origin, speculation about the origin of language and, in that context, consideration of the natural and conventional aspects of language extend throughout the tradition. At all times the discussion of the nature of man and society considers language as one of the principal characteristics of the specifically 941. 942 The great ideas human world or compares the language of men with the speech of brutes. In addition there is the broad philosophical inquiry into the nature of signs and symbols in general. This is not limited to the problem of how written or spoken words get their meaning. The general question calls for an examination of every type of signifying and every sort of symbol, verbal and nonverbal, natural and artificial, human and divine. Though these matters are closely related to the problems of language and may therefore be touched upon here, their main treatment is reserved for the chapter on sign and symbol. The treatment of language seems to have a different tenor in ancient and modern times. The philosophers of antiquity appreciate the need to safeguard discourse from the aberrations of speech. Plato and Aristotle usually preface their discussion of a subject with an examination of the relevant words in current use. Discovering the variety of meanings attached to common words, they take pains to enumerate the various senses of a word, and to put these meanings in some order. They pursue definitions or construct them to control the ambiguity that is latent in the language anyone must use to express or communicate ideas. But they do not expect to remove ambiguity entirely. They tend to accept the fact that the same word will have to be used in a number of senses, and they discriminate between the occasions when it is desirable to be precise about a word's meaning and those times when the purpose of discourse is better served by permitting a word to carry a whole range of meanings. They see no special difficulty in abstract as opposed to concrete words, or in general names as distinguished from the proper names which designate individuals, or in words which refer to purely intelligible objects like ideas rather than to the objects of sense experience. The mood of the ancients, which also prevails for the most part among the philosophers and theologians of the Middle Ages, seems to express a certain tolerance of the imperfections of language. If men do not think clearly, if they do not reason cogently or argue honestly, the fault is primarily the result of the misuse of their faculties, not of the betrayal of their intentions by the intractable character of language as an instrument. Even when men misunderstand one another, the inadequacy of language as a medium of communication is not solely responsible for the failure of minds to meet through the interchange of words. With greater effort, with the more assiduous application of the liberal arts, men can succeed even if language works against them. Some things are inexpressible in human speech even as they are incapable of being fully grasped by human thought. My vision, Dante says when he reaches the mystic rose of paradise, was greater than our speech. Such knowledge as we can have of the highest matters and the first principles of things Plato thinks does not admit of exposition like other branches of knowledge. In his 7th letter, he even goes so far as to say that no man of intelligence will venture to express his philosophical views in language. With these exceptions, the ancients seem to adopt a mood of tolerance towards language. This does not imply an underestimation of the difficulties of using language well. It simply does not make of language an insidious enemy of clarity and truth. The deficiencies of language are like the weaknesses of the flesh. As man can in large part overcome them through the discipline of the moral virtues, so through the discipline of the liberal arts, by skill in grammar, rhetoric, and logic, he can make language express almost as much truth as he can acquire, and communicate it almost as clearly as he can think it. Men need not succumb to the tyranny of words if they will make the requisite effort to master language to serve their purpose. But the liberal arts do not guarantee purity of purpose. Obscurantism, obfuscation, deception, and falsification are sometimes the aim. Men try to persuade others at all costs, or to win the argument regardless of where the truth lies. They try to confuse their opponents or mislead their audience. The use of language for such ends requires as much skill as its employment in the service of truth. If such use is a misuse, then language is equally available for use or misuse. It is an ancient saying that only the competent in grammar can make grammatical errors intentionally. So, as Plato recognizes, the Div. Chapter 45. Language 943 Difference between the sophist and the philosopher. Her is not one of skill but of purpose. When he criticizes the trickery of sophistical argument, he also acknowledges the cleverness with which he sophists juggle words and propound absurdities under the cover of superficially significant speech. The sophistical fallacies which Aristotle enumerates are seldom accidental errors, far being the result of the impediments which language places in the way of thought. They are large measure artfully contrived equivocations. They are ways of using language against logic. According to Aristotle, they represent lull fighting in disputation and are resorted to only by those who are resolved to win at all costs. In the modern treatment of language there is more of an imputation that words cause men unwittingly to deceive themselves as often as they enable one man intentionally to deceive another. Men are duped or tricked by the tendency of words to counterfeit a reality which does not exist. This, in the view of Hobbes or Locke, Berkeley or Hume, is particularly true of general or universal names, or words that signify nothing which can be perceived or imagined. We cannot imagine anything infinite, says Hobbes. Hence a word like infinite is a form of absurd speech taken upon credit, without any signification at all, from deceived philosophers and deceived, or deceiving, schoolmen. In addition to the deceptions of ordinary ambiguity and of metaphorical speech, Hobbes pays particular attention to the absurd, insignificant, or nonsensical use of words whereby we conceive nothing but the sound. He gives us examples, not merely round quadrangle, but infused virtue, free will, and immaterial substance. In the light of the examples, this theory of insignificant or meaningless speech explains what Hobbes means when he says that words are wise men's counters. They do but reckon by them, but they are the money of fools. It also indicates how Hobbes uses the susceptibility of men to self-deception through language as a way of explaining the errors, he calls them absurdities, into which his predecessors have fallen. What is novel here is not that he disagrees with earlier thinkers on points of psychology and metaphysics or theology. but that he reduces what might be supposed to be an issue between true and false opinions to a difference between significant and absurd speech. His opponents might reply that unless his own views about matter and mind are true, his semantic criticism of them does not hold. They have been seduced by language into talking nonsense only if Hobbes is right in his metaphysics and psychology. The criticism of arguments which seem to rely on metaphors is not peculiarly modern. In his attack on the Platonic theory of ideas, Aristotle dismisses the statement that the forms are patterns and other things share in them as a use of empty words and poetical metaphors. But Hobbes carries this method of criticism much further. He frequently rests his case against other philosophers entirely on the ground that they are talking nonsense, though he himself catches the imagination, almost as often as Plato does, by his skillfully wrought metaphors. He would insist that what he says can always be rendered literally, whereas the metaphors of others conceal the insignificance of their speech. Bacon provides another illustration of the modern attitude which ascribes a diabolical character to language. There arises from a bad and unapt formation of words, he writes, a wonderful obstruction to the mind, nor can the definitions and explanations with which learned men are wont to guard and protect themselves in some instances afford a complete remedy. Words still manifestly force the understanding, throw everything into confusion, and lead mankind into vain and innumerable controversies and fallacies. He goes on to say that the idols imposed upon the understanding by words are of two kinds. They are either names of things which have no existence, or they are names of actual objects, but confused, badly defined, and hastily or irregularly abstracted from things. Here, as in the case of Hobbes, a theory of reality and of the way in which the mind draws its ideas from experience seems to underlie the charge that language tangles the mind in a web of words, so that it deals with words rather than with things. In the same spirit, though not from the same premises, Locke tells his reader why. 944 The great ideas he found it necessary to include in his essay concerning human understanding, the long third book on language, which examines in detail the imperfections as well as the abuses of words, and the remedies therefor, vague and insignificant forms of speech, and abuse of language, he says, have so long passed for mysteries of science, and hard or misapplied words with little or no meaning have, by prescription, such a right to be mistaken for deep learning and height of speculation, that it will not be easy to persuade either those who speak, or those who hear them, that they are but the covers of ignorance, and hindrance of true knowledge. So few are apt to think they deceive, or are deceived in the use of words, or that the language of the sect they are of has any faults in it, without judging the fundamental issues involved concerning the nature of things and of man and his mind. One point seems to be clear. According as men hold different conceptions of the relation of language to thought, and in consequence assume different attitudes toward the imperfections or misuse of language, they inevitably take opposite sides on these issues. Whether the discipline of language is called semantics or the liberal arts, the standards by which one man criticizes the language often other seem to depend upon what he holds to be true. The present work on the great ideas aims, in part, to record the agreements and disagreements among the great minds of the Western tradition. It also records how those minds have used the same word in different senses, or have used quite distinct words for the same thing. It could not do either unless it did both. This indicates the basic relationship between language and thought which the great books exemplify, even when they do not explicitly make it the basis of their discussion of the relation between language and thought. The ideal of a perfect and universal language seems to arise in modern times from dissatisfaction with the inadequacy of ordinary language for the analytical refinement and precision of mathematics or science. As Descartes holds up the method of mathematics as the procedure to be followed in all other inquiries and subject matters, so his conception of a universal mathsis calls for a language which shall be the perfect instrument of analysis and demonstration. It is sometimes supposed that the symbolism of mathematics is itself that perfect language. Lavoisier quotes Condillac to the effect that algebra, in the most simple, most exact, and best manner, is at the same time a language and an analytical method. Of the analytical equations which Descartes was the first to introduce into the study of curves and surfaces, Fourier remarks that they extend to all general phenomena. There cannot be a language more universal and more simple, more free from errors and obscurities, that is to say, more worthy to express the invariable relations of natural things. Its chief attribute is clearness. It has no marks to express confused notions. It follows the same course in the study of all phenomena. It interprets them by the same language. This praise of mathematical symbolism indicates that one feature of the ideal is an exact correspondence between words and ideas, like three impressions of the same seal. Lavoisier says, the word ought to produce the idea, and the idea to be a picture of the fact. If there were a perfect one-to-one correspondence between physical symbols and mental concepts, there would never be any failures of communication. Men would be able to understand each other as well as if they could see directly into each other's minds. Though they still used external signs as a medium of communication, they would approximate the immediate communication which the theologians attribute to angels. In addition, the process of thinking itself, quite apart from communication, could be perfectly regulated by the rules of grammar, the rules for manipulating symbols, in the sense in which Lavoisier says that the art of reasoning is nothing more than a language well arranged. The rules of thought might be reduced to the rules of syntax if there were a perfect language. If the symbols of mathematics lack the universality to express every sort of concept, then it may be necessary, as Leibniz proposes, to construct a universal characteristic which would make possible a symbolic calculus for the performance of all the operations of thought. This conception seems to contain the principle and the motivation for the various logistical schemes which accompany the
Chapter 45, Language 945 Modern Development of Symbolic or Mathematical Logic, from Vol.2 Canal, see autorat.
Modern development of symbolic or mathematical logic, from Bull and Venn to Cano, see Alturat, Russell, and Whitehead. The hopes to be realized by an algebra of logic find expression in Jevons' plan for a logical abacus which, like an adding machine or comptometer, would be a thinking machine able to solve all problems that can be put in suitable terms. Is the ideal of a perfect and universal language a genuine hope or a utopian dream? Not all modern scientists seem to agree with Lavoisier's point that the improvement of a science and the improvement of its language are inseparable. Faraday, for example, apologizing for the invention of new words to name electrical phenomena, says that he is fully aware that names are one thing and science another. The utopian character of the ideal seems to be implied in Swift's satirization of a universal language. On his voyage to the cloudland of the scientists in Laputa, Gulliver learns of a project which is being considered by the professors of language. Since words are only names for things, it would be more convenient for all men to carry about them such things as were necessary to express the particular business they are to discourse on. The substitution of things for words would thus provide a universal language to be understood in all civilized nations. In the ancient world, the imperfection of ordinary speech gives rise, not to the conception of a perfect language which man should try to construct, but to the consideration of the distinction between a hypothetical natural language and the existing conventional languages actually in use. If there were a natural language, it would not only be the same for all men everywhere, but its words would also be perfect images or imitations of things. That human language is conventional rather than natural may be seen not only in the plurality of tongues, but also in the fact that existing languages embody contradictory principles of symbolization. This fact, Plato suggests in the Cratylus indicates that human language does not originate as a gift from the gods, for if the gods had given men the names they use, signs would be perfectly and consistently adapted to things signified. The hypothesis of a natural or God-given language is not proposed as an ideal to inspire men to try to invent a perfect language for themselves. It functions rather as a norm for the criticism of man-made language and for discovering the natural elements common to all conventional languages. Like human society, human language seems to be partly natural, partly conventional, as there are certain political principles, such as that of natural justice, common to all societies despite the diversity of their customs and institutions. So all conventional languages have certain common characteristics of structure which indicate their natural basis in the physical and mental constitution of man. In the tradition of the liberal arts, the search for a universal grammar, applicable to all conventional languages, represents not the hope to create a universal or perfect language, but the conviction that all languages have a common, natural basis. The hypothesis of a natural language takes another form and has another implication in the Judeo-Christian tradition, where it is discussed in the light of certain portions of Revelation, yet it retains the same fundamental relevance to the problem of the origin and characteristics of the many conventional languages which now exist. Genesis relates how, after God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, he brought them to Adam to see what he would call them, and whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. The names which Adam devised constituted a natural language, at least insofar as, according to Augustine's interpretation, it is the one common language of the race both before the flood and for some time after. But there is the further question whether the names which Adam gave to things were their rightful or proper names, whether they were natural signs in the sense of true representations of the natures of the things signified. Hobbes suggests one answer when he says that the first author of speech was God himself, who instructed Adam how to name such creatures as he presented to his sight. Augustine suggests another answer by identifying the original language of man with Hebrew, and by affirming the continuity of the Hebrew spoken after Babel with the language all men spoke before the confusion of tongues. 946 At the time when men began to build a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, Genesis tells us that the whole earth was of one language and one speech. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. This, according to Hobbes, means that the language gotten and augmented by Adam and his posterity, was again lost at the Tower of Babel, when by the hand of God every man was stricken for his rebellion, with an oblivion of his former language. If the further implication is that the lost language was unlike any of the conventional languages in the historical record, then it may be supposed to have been that natural form of speech in which each thing is named according to its nature. The modern ideal of a perfect and universal language may even be looked upon as an impious wish to achieve what God took away from men at Babel. The problem of the origin of human language is not an easy one for the theologian. It is more difficult still for those who speculate about it in purely naturalistic terms. Rousseau tries to expose some of the perplexities in such speculations. If speech did not become a social necessity until men passed from isolation in a state of nature to living together in society, how, he asks, could societies have been formed before languages had been invented? If men need speech to learn to think, he remarks, they must have stood in much greater need of the art of thinking, to be able to invent that of speaking. The development of language is already in existence, or the way in which the child learns to speak through living in an environment where speech exists, by no means explains how languages were originally formed. Rousseau imagines a primitive condition in which men uttered instinctive cries to implore assistance in case of danger, or relief in case of suffering. He supposes that to such cries, men may have added gestures to signify visible and the great ideas movable objects, and imitative sounds to signify audible ones. Such methods of expression being insufficient to convey ideas about absent or future things, men had at last to invent the articulate sounds of the voice and to institute these as conventional signs. But, as he observes, such an institution could only be made by common consent, itself still more difficult to conceive, since such a common agreement must have had motives, and speech, therefore, seems to have been highly necessary in order to establish the use of it. The problem of the origin of human language is not only connected with the problem of the origin of human society, but also with the problem of the origin of man himself. The faculty of articulate speech does not, according to Darwin, offer any insuperable objection to the belief that man has been developed from some lower form, though the habitual use of articulate language is peculiar to man. He uses, in common with the lower animals, inarticulate cries to express his meaning, aided by gestures and the movements of the muscles of the face. The songs of birds and the speech of parrots show that animals